Hello, Must Readers! I'm Erin Popelka. I curate must-read fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. And I am so excited to be here today with Jenny Williams. Jenny, welcome to Must-Read Fiction.
Thank you so much, Erin. It's really exciting to be here.
Absolutely. It is such a pleasure to have you. A little bit about Jenny Williams. She is the author of The Atlas of Forgotten Places, this beautiful book on the table behind us, her first novel. She has her bachelor's from the University of California at Berkeley and her master's of fine arts in creative writing from Brooklyn College. She has lived and worked in Uganda and Germany and the United States and lives currently in Seattle. So Jenny, I can't wait to talk to you about this beautiful book. Tell me about The Atlas of Forgotten Places.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be chatting with you. And yeah, so The Atlas of Forgotten Places is my first novel. It is set in Uganda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it was very loosely inspired by some of the time that I spent in Central Africa when I was in 2006 as a volunteer aid worker, particularly in northern Uganda, and some of the stories that I heard, the experiences I had, and the experiences other people around me had had. And so, yeah, this book is sort of the result of many years of thought and research and interviews and talking to people. Yeah, and it's a story, I guess I should say something a little bit about the plot.
Sure.
So it is a story of two women, a German aid worker and a young Ugandan woman who both have loved ones who go missing in northern Uganda. And they have to come together to sort of solve the mystery of that disappearance.
Excellent. Yes, and there's lots of tension kind of pulling throughout, right? Because it's not only the story of these missing people, but also the backdrop of some pretty intense political conflict happening as well.
Right.
Yes.
And that was really important to me too, to have this kind of balance of, the setting was actually the first thing that came to me as I knew that I wanted to write a novel that was set in northern Uganda and that was about this conflict. Because it was something that I didn't know very much about before I lived there. And the more time I spent there and the more people I talked to, the more I felt really compelled by the situation and by the history. And so I knew that I wanted to write something about it, and then slowly the characters kind of made their way into the story. But yeah, it is a very sort of heady political situation and social conflict. War is always a complicated thing to write about, but I felt like it was the right setting to explore the kinds of questions that I was really interested in, and then to put characters that I cared about into this sort of situation and follow their stories.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the really interesting things about novels and fiction is that, yes, you have this backdrop of setting and all of these, kind of big political things happening, but ultimately we have to tell these stories through our characters, through their individual experiences and how they see all of those different pieces.
Right. And I think that's one of the most wonderful things about reading fiction, too, is that I feel like I can be dropped into a setting that is completely unfamiliar, that might be a fantasy world or a place that I've never been and a time period I don't know anything about, but it's because of the characters that there's some sense of a universal story that you get to care about them and follow them on their adventures and so I don't know, I guess I just felt like I knew that I wanted to write about Uganda and the DRC and this particular setting, but I also in the end, it's not really a novel about Uganda. It's a novel about people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so you were in Uganda in 2006, and the book is set kind of around the Christmas massacres in 2008, which is separate from your time there. So talk to me about your research process and how you went about kind of researching all of the pieces that were happening at that time, and then integrating that with your own personal experience.
Sure. Yeah. So research, of course, was a really important part of my process because I'm not Ugandan. I'm not a history scholar. I'm not an anthropologist. I am a fiction writer, and so I knew that I had to do my due diligence to sort of get the facts right. And having lived there, I had some additional insight into what that meant and how to get multiple perspectives. I had done a lot of interviews during my time there with people who had lived through the northern Ugandan war. And so when I decided that I was going to write about a different period of time than the time that I had spent there, I actually did go back to Uganda several times to do additional research. So I went back in 2010 and then again in 2013. So I was able to go to northern Uganda at a few different periods throughout its more modern recent history, and see how places had changed, see how the media was representing the evolution of this place, and then reading newspaper articles and reports and other nonfiction books that were published, speaking to people who had lived through these time periods. Like, all of that was part of my research experience.
Oh, fantastic. Which, it was quite extensive, yes, with travel to go along with it, absolutely.
And travel for me was, I didn't feel like I could write about these places without having been there. I know a lot of writers can. Maybe I just don't have a good enough imagination.
Well, there's also so many details factor into it, too, that's hard to imagine if you don't have those smells, don't see those colors, don't taste the food.
Right, and I think that was, so much of what was powerful for me about being in northern Uganda were exactly those sort of sensory details and the ordinariness of what that feels like. And so I definitely wanted the novel to feel immersive in the same kind of way and give those really specific details that would make you feel like you were there and that you were smelling these things and feeling the dust or the grit on your skin. And I maybe could have done that without traveling there, but it just wouldn't have felt as honest or as thorough, I think, as I wanted to be.
Fantastic. And one of your characters, Rose, is Ugandan, which is very different from your experience. And so talk to me about your process of writing her. How did you write her authentically?
I hope that I wrote her authentically. This is a really interesting question for me, because I definitely struggled with the question of how can I represent, or how can I write about northern Uganda if I'm only writing from the perspective of someone who isn't Ugandan. It felt very necessary to me to have both perspectives in the novel, and of course, while I was living there, I had a lot of Ugandan friends. I worked with my Ugandan colleagues who had, all of whom had in some way had a very personal experience in the northern Ugandan conflict. They had lost family members. They had themselves been abducted by the LRA. And so I was able in that way to gain some level of understanding of what that was like. They were very, very generous in sharing with me their experiences. And then of course, research. Reading a ton of sort of first-person accounts, interviews other people have done with former child soldiers, formerly abducted people, and in some ways stitching together those facts into a kind of fabric. That fabric itself isn't a character, so it still became necessary for me to I don't want to say invent Rose or create her, but to kind of discover her, because I do feel like she emerged slowly over time as I wrote her. She was actually, I wrote two different versions of this novel, very, very different from each other, very different, literally completely different novels, except one scene that was the same. And in the first novel, Rose was a supporting character. She wasn't one of the main characters, but I felt strongly about her, and there was something really compelling about this character that felt unfinished to me or unexplored. And so when I decided to write a new version of this novel, she sort of came forward as the voice that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell her story. I wanted to hear her story. And it seemed important for me as well to write about women in war. I think often the experiences of women get underrepresented in war stories.
Sure. And
so having Rose be someone who's her experiences are maybe a little bit unexpected, and then having Sabina, who's the German counterpart, I suppose, who also represents a sort of female in war experience that we don't think about as often as an aid worker, or someone who's kind of given up her life in a lot of ways to be in other places and serve people. So yeah.
And certainly with Rose, there's a particularly powerful scene with a reconciliation ceremony, and so having her to give us access to some of that tradition happening, it was an incredibly moving scene.
Oh yeah, I mean, I actually have never witnessed a reconciliation ceremony. It's something also that's a little bit controversial as well, because it's there were questions of is this something that we are as foreigners are sort of imposing on a culture? Are we expecting certain kinds of forgiveness experiences? Are we like changing it in a way for our needs, to think that this is the way forward? Of course it's the way forward. Are we judging this in some way?
Interesting, because that comes up in the novel too, in terms of the question of, would that ceremony work for, kind of some of the members of the rebel army, or does that need to be international justice? And this question, that tension between, kind of local tradition versus international expectations is certainly at play.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, because I don't feel like the novel provides an answer to any of these things.
Novels tend to not. They ask great questions, right?
Yeah. And I feel like that's the job of a novelist, is to surface some of those questions and ask them, and present the complicated material around those questions. And in some way conflicting answers or conflicting experiences. I definitely didn't. Part of what was important to me about having the two perspectives, Rose and Sabina, was that I felt like each of them could kind of bring some of these questions to light and have a different perspective on what it meant for them and for their cultures, but also not have them necessarily represent their cultures. I don't feel like this is the story of the Ugandan and the German, or the foreigner. It's really, the novel is about these two specific women.
Sure.
And so, I guess in that way, I do feel like it was my job to ask questions, not answer them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you talked earlier about, kind of the novel exploring some big questions that you wanted to explore. Were there other big questions that you were looking to explore?
I think, the question for me that I struggled with while I was living there, and even still to this day on some level, was the question of like, how does one person help, or how does one person make a difference? I think it's a bit of a cliche question, like how do I make a difference, or can one person make a difference? And of course the complicated sense of like the white savior, and how why should I know what's better for this culture than they know themselves, and the idea of foreigners coming in and changing things, and so when I was in Uganda, I definitely had this sense of like, I think it's one of the most noble instincts we have as humans, is to see, when you see suffering, is that you want to help in some way.
Yeah.
But the form of that help and the outcome it's not easy. It's not simple. It is really complicated. And so how do you sort of channel or harness that instinct to help with the kind of truth of what that help might mean?
Sure.
And I don't know necessarily. I feel like what I learned for myself was that being there as an aid worker wasn't the right answer for me. I felt like the way that I could help in some way was through storytelling, and through bringing some of these stories to a wider audience. At the time that I started writing this novel, there were no other novels that were set in northern Uganda about this conflict.
Wow.
There were quite a number of nonfiction books, but it seemed like an opportunity to bring some of these stories, to Western audiences.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for bringing the stories.
Of course.
Yeah, and so you have also lived and worked in Germany, in addition to living and working in Uganda and the United States. What do you miss about living and working abroad?
Oh gosh, so many things.
Yeah.
I really love the experience of just being that kind of tension between being in a new place where there's so many things that are unfamiliar or new, but also finding the familiar and building relationships and building communities in a new place. It's funny because I was just talking to someone the other day about how when I lived in Uganda, and then again when I lived in Germany, there's this kind of instinct to feel like, oh, I'm traveling, I should be out exploring new things every day. But in fact, what I find is that when I'm happiest in those situations, when I am, have a sort of my habits and I'm living my ordinary life in this extraordinary place. So I mean, I do miss it. I don't miss the German weather.
Fair enough.
Especially now that I'm in Seattle. I don't miss that. And I'm happy to be in the States where my family is, and and where I don't struggle with the language every single day.
Right. Because there is, something about living abroad where it's just uncomfortable enough, that it is hard to find those routines and relax into those routines that you can do at home. But there's a beauty in that, kind of discomfort, right? Because there's a lens that you can see things with that it's harder to see when you're comfortable. So, but there's also the other side of it where it's just really uncomfortable all the time.
No, I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. And it's funny because I wrote this novel while I was living in Germany.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think that certainly that's a lot of what influenced Sabina, this German character, was what it felt like I was living in Marburg, in this small town where she's living at the beginning of the novel. And I was working from home, and I was spending 4 or 5 hours a day. I was working part-time, telecommuting, and then writing 3 to 4 hours every single day in my little office in Germany where I could see the forest, from my window. And it became the fact that I was writing there instead of writing from New York or from Colorado or from California or any other place that I'd lived in the United States, it felt like the novel itself was also this new landscape or this kind of foreign place for me, and that I got to be a tourist or a traveler and explore the space of the novel as I would explore a new city in some ways.
Sure.
But it was funny because I spent so much time with these characters. I wrote the versions of the novel over the course of several years, and I had spent so much time with them that they became real people to me. And I remember I had this moment, you'll appreciate this, I had this moment in Marburg where I was like, I really want to start a book club because I was missing community and I wanted to talk to people about books. And the first person I thought of to ask to join was Sabina.
Oh my gosh, that's perfect.
Yeah. Because it's like I could imagine her walking, I was imagining her walking around the city and imagining her life there and her childhood there.
Right.
And then it took me a few seconds to be like, oh no, she's not real. she's a
Great
character
idea.
in my novel.
You're like, I could write that scene of Sabina going to a book club, but it won't happen in my life.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. And that must have been really interesting too, living in a place, in a different language and then writing in English. So you're like living in German, writing in English. Was that a tricky tension with the language?
It was and it wasn't. I mean, I did study German and I spoke German okay when I was there.
Sure.
But I wasn't like living in German. It wasn't like an on and off switch.
Okay.
My husband at the time and I would speak in English together, So I did speak in German, sort of on a daily basis, but I definitely felt like English was the space of it was my creative space as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So the book came out in July.
It did, yeah.
So have you gotten to talk to readers, meet readers? How has the reception been for the months that it's been out so far?
Yeah, I mean, it has been incredibly gratifying to hear from people who have read the novel. I'm so touched every time I get an email from a reader or someone sends me a note that just says, this was amazing. It's one of my favorite books of the year. It's just, it's really humbling, I think, to have spent so much time with characters in this story, and then to let it go into the world. And it's a little bit like, I suppose watching a child go off to college or something. And, good luck, little book. It's been incredible. I met with a book club a few weeks ago that had read the novel, and it was so fascinating because I was getting the feedback from people who had such strong opinions about these characters and about what was happening to them, and they had their own theories about why things happened. You know, the ending in particular is a little bit ambiguous, I would say, and so everybody had a different opinion about, you know, what was happening and why, and I just so appreciated that, and they appreciated that as well. That at first they were like, I wanted to be able to close the book and be done with it and have it all wrapped up nice and neatly, but as I kept thinking about it, I liked that I did keep thinking about it, that it was something that stayed with me, and that for me as a writer is, you know, that's a really meaningful experience to be able to offer readers, is to give someone something that they do keep thinking about and keep returning to in some way.
Sure, and isn't that just the nature of questions too, right? That at one point you're like, oh, I've got the answer, and then a few years later you're like, I thought I had the answer, right? Right, and then a decade later you're like, oh, I'm seeing this question in a whole different light altogether.
Yeah, and I think especially some of the sort of like really meaty moral questions that I come up against in the novel, I had probably a very different opinion about those questions when I started writing than when I do now, because it does change, and we change. The questions don't necessarily change, but I think they, you know, we sort of gain new perspectives on them through our own experience. Yeah, so I hope it's the kind of book that someone could read, you know, once and have an experience, and read it 5 years later or 10 years later, and have, you know, empathize with different characters in some way.
Wonderful. Yeah. Oh, well, we should check back in 5 years, 10 years, see how it's feeling, to you, must reader. Well, Jenny Williams, thank you so very much for taking the time to talk with me today, and thank you so much for wading into big questions with the Atlas of Forgotten Places.
Well, thank you so much for reading and for hosting this wonderful conversation. This is really such a pleasure.
Thank you.